So, Justin, you asked, how was native biodiversity inclusion considered in the scheme? Dan.
Yeah, it's a good question, Justin. So to go back to the SAB application that we did, so this was linked to that Schedule 3 new process running alongside planning. One of the standards we need to consider is the biodiversity standard. And I recognize that it's quite vague, and so it needs work. But in terms of the biodiversity side of things, we worked with our landscape architect. And so she drew on learning from projects like Greener Grangetown about what plants have worked. Some of them didn't at the initial plant spec from Greener Grangetown. So that side of things, and then making sure that what we were proposing would increase biodiversity across the area. I think, Justin, you also might be interested to know like the beyond the red line boundary. And if I'm totally honest, I'm not too sure how much work did go on to consider where does Wood Street fit within bigger Cardiff, and making sure that the plants we're proposing include native species to enhance that. Feel free to drop me an email and I can come back on more specifics than that.
Indeed. Sorry, for some reason it shut me off. I'm back on here now. Yeah, no, indeed, it was about the native plants and trees chosen. Actually, I think I caught most of what you were saying, and it's something that Cardiff certainly needs to work on in the future in terms of these sort of schemes and how native species are incorporated.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we're learning going forwards, is that it's not a kind of one size fits all in terms of the types of plants that go into SUDS features. But at the same time, what works best from a water point of view and removing pollutants might not be the best from a biodiversity point of view. And so having spoken to colleagues like yourself and others, I recognize that although they're good projects in and of themselves, that we've got things to learn and we could bring in different skill sets that perhaps we need to get ecologist input, not just a landscape architect. And so that's something that I'm trying to encourage from our designs going forward and to share, is that I know we've not got the perfect solution, and so trying to improve what we've done going forwards.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Dan. Got a question the next one on my list was from Naomi about future climate predictions. Naomi, if you could unmute yourself if you're on the call and ask Dan your question. We can't hear you, Naomi. Oh.
If that was the question, Pete, I'm happy to answer that from what you just said. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Naomi said, "Did you consider future climate predictions when planning and choosing what to plant, etc.?"
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Particularly from my watery background, it was a really key consideration to understand. Okay, well, we might be seeing this amount of rain now, but what's going to happen in the future? And so one of the things that we agreed quite early on with the council was what uplift should we include for climate change? And so what we agreed was an increase of 30% for climate change. So in our hydraulic modeling, we included 30%, and then in terms of the storage, making sure that with that allowance, there was going to be enough attenuation in the system so there wasn't flooding above ground. That also included looking at how much flow was going to be released from the outfall. And so I mentioned we were tapping into an existing system. And so we included those uplift values for climate change for water being discharged to the River Taff. And so we were able to demonstrate that there wasn't going to be any detriment to downstream habitat, and the volumes that we were going to see at the 1 in 30 plus climate change, 1 in 100 plus climate change were acceptable, and that existing system could handle it.
I'm hoping that that answered Naomi's question. I'm really sorry the microphone didn't work there. The next question that we had was from Katie Metcalf. Katie, are you still on the call? And if so, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi Dan, it was a really interesting talk. What a challenge. I had no idea there was so much rubbish under Cardiff streets. I was just wondering, how did you select the tree species to go in the pits? And what sort of considerations went into that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I think it's similar to Justin's question from earlier. So the tree species, that was led by our landscape architect. And they looked at the type of context that the trees are going to be in. And so, for example, the tree pits on the south side, we wanted to specify trees that would prefer to grow up rather than out, because they would then start to encroach into where vehicles were going to be. And from the maintenance point of things, we'd have to shut the lane to try and maintain some of those trees as they grow. They also were keen to specify not just the same tree, but complementary trees. But I think it was linked to best practice, what we've done before, what's worked well. But I think perhaps one of the things that could be improved going forwards is understanding Wood Street in the broader context and other habitat and what are the species around. And so I would hope that they did consider that in the specification, but I can't say for certain. And so that's something to definitely raise going forwards.
Thank you, that's great. Really great talk.
And I know that Lucy from Social Farms and Gardens asked a very similar question, and she had to leave just before you answered Katie's question. So hopefully that. Oh, you're still there, Lucy. Has that answered your question?
I was actually on a work call, but yeah, it was just around the about the tree species and plants that you chose for just in terms of good plants for drainage and biodiversity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I didn't get your answer to the previous because I was on a call.
No, that's okay. So I think one thing to say about the planting is that the rain gardens particularly would be dry 99% of the time. And so even though they're called rain gardens, I think there can be the misconception that they hold water and they're like mini ponds, which isn't the case. So the plants that need to go in, it's really important that they're drought tolerant, because most of the time there won't be water, but we're introducing a lot more catchment to be diverted into these planted areas. And so they need to be able to withstand lots of water entering, and in some cases starting to pond temporarily before water starts to filter through. I think one of the things to perhaps improve on going forwards is making sure that the planting mix, yes, it's got to think about the drainage side of things, but from a biodiversity point of view, making sure that we're making the most of this opportunity of kind of naturalizing our hard spaces. And so having more of an input from an ecologist would be a step in the right direction, I think.
Brilliant. I hope that answered Lucy's question. We've got 10 minutes left in the discussion before I promised I'd release Dan. The next question that I'd got from the previous session was from Jacques Sisson, my colleague, asking about soil. Jacques, are you still on the call? Doesn't look like it. So
that's okay. I can still answer that soil related question.
Yeah, well, she asked, how does the soil remain enriched given that there's no access for fallen leaves to add to the humus?
Oh, okay, that was a bit more specific than I thought.
Just to keep you on your toes.
So speaking about the soil that we specified, it was a SUDS specification. So it's not your typical topsoil that you might get from the garden centre. I mentioned that drainage is one of the key things. And what we can't have is having too much of a clay content so the water ponds on top and then it doesn't filter through to remove pollutants from the road, petrol, brakes, tires, etc. Whilst not allowing water to drain so fast that actually it's not doing some of those water quality benefits. And so we worked with a separate consultant about this SUDS soil mix. And granted, we actually learned an awful lot about do's and don'ts of a soil mix and the context, particularly with a lot of silt coming off from the road, probably linked to high traffic, but the types of vehicles that use it. I can't really speak to necessarily the specification itself. I think we did lean on the expertise of those colleagues in that sub-consultancy just to make sure that there was, I guess, enough organic content and that the soil would stand the test of time. But I can't speak to more of those specific questions, sorry.
Hopefully that's covered Jack's point, and she can watch the answer in the discussion video. And I'm hoping that she'll be able to email you or your colleagues to find out more about how we keep the soil going. I know a little bit about this because I've worked with David Fryer and with my other colleague who is the soil scientist on the Greener Grangetown scheme. And there's a very, very fine line you're drawing between providing enough rooting medium with enough nutrients and the drainage ability. And I think there's quite a few stories that could be told about the soil mix for the Wood Street scheme, and how I think it was Green Blue Urban had to work very hard to make sure the soil was permeable enough. Excuse me. Enough of me. Robert Chapman asked a question. Rob, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Good morning, everyone. Dan, congratulations and a great presentation. Forgive me, it is a leading question, Dan, but you may want to give an opinion or a viewpoint or not. But for me, that area, that sort of grey, uninspiring area immediately outside of the front door into the capital city of Wales is, in my humble opinion, underwhelming. And I just feel there was a lost opportunity to introduce, do correct me if I'm wrong, a whole range of tree species. Yes, it could have been managed, because I understand there's a visitor management scenario, but surely there must have been scope to build in carefully some drainage, because that's a very large sort of hard surfaced area, unless I'm missing something, and the runoff from that, etc., etc. But it just struck me that wouldn't it have been nice to have seen the introduction of a decent quantity of green infrastructure to take cognizance of the visitor management challenges, rather than probably at last count 5 trees. What would you have done?
Yeah, I guess I gotta be careful-ish because this is getting recorded. But
I did tell you it's a leading question,
yeah, no, I
and
know.
I'm not trying to trip you up. I'm saying that I just think it's a missed opportunity, and
so I guess speaking as a resident of Cardiff,
yes,
I think what a shame. Like,
yeah.
it looks terrible, for want of another word. It's just like the old way of doing things. It's for convenience and flexibility that gives you the option to, I don't know, put some stalls on top maybe around Christmas, and maybe you can allow for queues to be better for match days. But if that's the case, that's incredibly narrow-minded. One thing to say is that project would have been designed prior to this new SUDS legislation. And so I'm hopeful that everything post 2019, from a design point of view, won't be like that. And that's hopefully what it deters, is developments that are just incredibly hard and lack any nature. And I agree that in terms of managing people for queues, say, on match days, you can use trees and other planting to be able to actually quite cleverly put people and separate them without needing metal barriers. And not even just a few trees that you might see on Wood Street. I think the expanse of that space, we could have done something so exciting. I've raised it in passing to colleagues at the council, but of course it's not really my decision about if they do change it and then where that money comes from. But I'd love to see that changed. And I know it's been paved quite recently, but Cardiff is setting the tone for bringing nature back to the city, and so that could be one that they could change in the near future. I'm hopeful.
Just a final comment, Dan. Sorry, I wasn't trying to trip you up there. I've expressed the view of myself personally, and indeed I've expressed the view to Councillor Carol Wild. A really desperate missed opportunity, I think, and sadly, with the policies that you talked about in your presentation, that the council might now want to take more cognizance of, it would be, well, you know, the only way you can change that now is a retrofit scenario. And what a waste! What a wasted opportunity. Anyway, I'll close out there.
So hopefully somebody from Cardiff who's a decision maker may be watching this discussion, and who knows what we might see in the future. We're rapidly running out of time. I wonder if I could turn to Jenny, if your connection's still up. Could you ask your question, Jenny Dickinson?
To try. Apologies, I do keep cutting out, so I keep having to redo all of things. But I was just interested to know what, you know, presumably Cardiff Council are really supportive of this, and we've seen it in Grangetown as well. So do you know if they, you know, are they keen to keep pursuing retrofitting sites across the city, and if they've got like a, you know, identified opportunity areas, and if they've got any sort of priority areas and timescales associated with it?
I think I caught that. So let me repeat it back. I think you were asking about, are Cardiff Council going to continue retrofitting sustainable drainage across the city, and understanding where the best place to do it is going to be?
Pretty much,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I can't talk on behalf of the council, but I guess what I'm aware of is that there was a recent local flood risk strategy consultation, which was out to the public, and I filled it in as member Cardiff. That's closed, and they're now digesting and preparing what that flood risk strategy looks like. Cardiff being where it is, we've got multiple things that can cause flood risk, but we've got the sea, so we've got Cardiff Bay Barrage, we've got rivers that run through, the three main ones being the Taff, Ely, Rumney. And so there's flood risk from those when it rains a lot. But there's also surface water flood risk, and that's probably the main one that interests me, and the one that impacts people the most, because it's of its nature and flash flooding, and it can happen very quickly and ruin lives, frankly. So I'm hopeful that urban and surface water drainage is going to be a key part of this local flood risk strategy. I can't talk about, I haven't seen any of the content. I know they had a lot of responses from members of Cardiff, which is exciting to hear. I'm hopeful though, because of conversations with some of the leadership at the council, that it's not just a kind of tick box, they've done two, so great. I think they are really keen to roll it out across the city. They've done other projects that I'm aware of being like, well, things that people may not agree of being successes or not, but Tudor Street, Cowbridge Road East, we've got the Canal Quarter, Cathays Terrace. So it's things that I'm aware of that's happening across Cardiff, not my projects, but nice to see this type of development. And I'm hopeful that that shows a statement of intent from the council that they want to align themselves to doing this kind of development.
Dan, thank you so much for that. I jumped over M. Collinson's question, and I know I said I'd release you at 11:30 prompt. Have you got 1 minute to answer his question?
Yeah, that's fine.
Hi there, thanks. There was just two questions, hopefully short ones, but is there somewhere I can find sort of further sort of online specs for shallow rain garden plants? Because it's very relevant to a project I was looking at. Is there a company or something?
As far as I'm aware, that doesn't exist. It's
Okay.
something that I've, at least because I've worked a lot with Cardiff Council, suggested that it'd be useful to produce some like standard details.
Yeah.
But in terms of a generic thing that is widely accessible, I'm not aware of something that does exist. Apologies if there's someone on the line who can signpost,
yeah.
But yeah, so
okay.
Sorry.
And then the other one is just about, you mentioned about desire lines, and I spent a while looking at it, and I just wondered, aside from observations of the site, do you have any other methods for identifying desire lines across an area?
Yeah, it doesn't sound too scientific, but we
yeah.
walked it. We kind
Oh,
of
yeah,
just
yeah,
did
yeah.
a visual assessment. I think that nothing really beats an in-person site visit. And I know with all the digital stuff we've got, and Street View is definitely my friend for my projects, but just
Sure.
being there yourself and seeing how people interact with the space, but also preempting what would happen on match days when the road was shut. That was a bit more tricky. So
That's good to know,
at least
yeah.
for this project, that's what we did.
Thank you. Cheers. It sounds really interesting.